note-taking for legal compliance presentation. We created this presentation for all members of the IEP team. We're hoping that our case managers, related service providers, psychologists, and administrators all take the time to view this important information. We'd like to take just a moment to introduce ourselves and what our position is in the district, how we support you. I'm Michelle Ballesteros, and I am the coordinator of special education, and I oversee and support mild to moderate programs.
Hi, I'm Audrey Butler, and I am a program specialist. I support the mild moderate program at the elementary level, and my partner is.
Hi, I'm Crystal Clark. I'm Audrey's partner in crime at work. We both share the elementary mild moderate caseload. I'm glad you're joining us today.
Hi, my name's John Feringa, and I'm a program specialist in the district working with the students who need behavioral support. Some of the sites that I support include Alessandro, the middle schools, the 2 ED programs, and then students that are out at non-public schools.
Hi, my name is Brian Wager. I work together with John supporting behavior in the district and specifically the high school ED programs and also those kids that are at that non-public school.
We're going to start with our 11 commitments. Today, we're going to focus on commitment number 1, always start with why. The reason we chose this commitment for this presentation is that as we go through the slides, you'll start to understand the why behind the suggested verbiage in the notes page for each of the components of the IEP.
Here's our vision and mission statement. It's our new one, and we're going to start with our vision. Our vision, I always like to look at the vision as where we're going, and it is to empower students to become future ready and positively impact the world. And our mission, I look at that as our how. How do we get to our vision? We will provide an equitable education for all students to be prepared for college and/or a viable career path for a successful life.
Thank you, Audrey. And I wanted to ask Crystal a question this morning. Crystal, can you speak to the why as why we created this training?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, the why behind the training is that there have been different practices in the past on how notes were to be taken. If you started 15 years ago like I did, brief was best. And your notes were really, really brief, maybe a paragraph. And so we want to get everybody on the same playing field where everybody understands the expectations and we're all acting in the same way when it comes to notes, because they really do help to defend the compliance of the IEP and to explain what happened in that IEP meeting, because sometimes the IEP itself doesn't speak to what actually occurred in the meeting and the amount of parent input that's received during the IEP meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, would you share with our viewers what are some of the learning outcomes that we planned for this training, as well as how deep are we going to go into the creation of the IEP and that side of the compliance?
Well, I think we're primarily focusing on writing legally compliant notes and notes that really tell the story of the IEP, right? Every IEP has sort of a narrative arc that it follows. And I think it's really important for the notes, not only to hit the important legal points, but to tell that story of the IEP in a really clear and succinct way. So it's a balance, right? Between, just writing everything down that happens and sitting there, with a dictaphone in the basement after the meeting and just, dictating everything, and getting a good succinct picture of what happened in the IEP. And it's important for the team members who are there when you review them in the end so that everybody knew what happened. But it's also especially important for any service providers or anybody who's looking at the IEP afterward to try and decipher what took place in the meeting, what requests were made, what discussions were had, so that they can go through and, if they need to pinpoint any particular requests or whatever.
Absolutely. And I know as creators of this presentation, we were trying to strike a balance between maintaining a focus on writing legally compliant notes and then doing sidebars about, oh yeah, when you are completing this page and when you're covering this page, don't forget to do X, Y, and Z as process. So Brian, one more time, give us a blanket statement, a blanket waiver for us if we don't go fully into the procedural piece.
A lot of procedural items are going to come up, right? We're going to come up with a lot of items that trigger procedural questions and procedural concerns. The purpose of this training really is first and foremost to go through note taking and how to strategize for note taking. If procedural questions come up, direct those questions to your program specialist. Look through the SELPA manual to find an answer to those questions. I know the team has been hard at work updating a lot of stuff in the SELPA manual, and your program specialists are good resources to go to. So again, we're trying to focus explicitly and specifically on note taking and how to develop those skills.
Thank you. Thank you. Can any of you share potential hiccups that could occur if the notes are not legally compliant? Maybe a specific example or what have you?
So I'll share. I know that there's times when there's information that is shared at the IEP and it's not in the notes. And then when a parent may come to the office and they may have a concern, and we go back and we look at the IEP and we look at the notes to see exactly what happened at the IEP. Teams share information with us, but it's not in the notes. And so that's one of the hiccups is that, is making sure that you get the right information in there, not too much information, but getting the legally compliant information in there for us to move forward to support you and the families.
All right, so the purpose of note taking. I think this is an interesting conversation since everyone might have a different take on it. So what is your idea of note taking and what's the purpose of it?
So I think that the notes really help to detail the conversation and parent participation in the meeting. And it kind of helps to outline how things are progressing as you go through the IEP.
It also helps to document compliance with things that have to happen in the IEP, right? So those mandatory procedures like, did you present procedural safeguards? Were there questions about them? Were there questions about offer FAPE? All those things that have to be documented, the notes place is a good place to document those things.
I think it also further explains like the participation and making sure that you've gone through all of the pages of the IEP when you're documenting the information in the notes. You're documenting, in our district, we follow our IEP agenda, our collaborative IEP agenda, which goes through all of the pages. So the notes will help to show that we have actually gone through all of those forms.
Actual participation in the IEP by the team members who are required is so important, right? And there's not like a form in the IEP to say like who said what when. So the notes are really helpful to show that the parent actually had meaningful participation. Gen ed teacher actually had meaningful participation. The notes is that, again, it's that narrative that really shows who participated and where, because that's an essential component, that participation element.
So everyone's mentioned some really good aspects of note taking, but I did have one question. So the IEP forms contain many of the elements that are discussed in an IEP. What specifically do you look for documenting in the notes?
So again, going back to what was shared previously, it really is to give more detail to the conversation and the flow of the meeting, and also to point out when parents have questions, how does and we'll get further into this, I won't spend too much time here, but like, how does the IEP team respond when a parent has a question? How do they respond to that request to meet that need? I did also want to add, another purpose of note taking for me, if I'm the one who's writing the notes, I also think if this child was to move to another school district and parent has a copy of the IEP, but maybe the reports aren't available. And so the person that intercepts that IEP can refer to the notes and see what, as they were forming eligibility, and just putting little basics from any reports also is very, very helpful because it does tell the story.
So strategies for note taking. There's a lot of different ways to take notes. Some of them are great. Some of them work really well. Some of them are not so great. So what do you guys think? What is one of the best ways to take notes collaboratively in an IEP meeting?
I attend a lot of IEPs, and sometimes it's hard taking notes and keeping up with the conversation and knowing when to jump in and following the conversation. So a good way to take notes collaboratively is using a Google Doc and sharing it with multiple team members and everybody jumping in and taking notes are participating in the note taking, because if I'm talking, I can't be taking notes at the same time, but there's important information that's being shared at that time that may need to be documented in the notes. And it's kind of difficult to go back and recap what has been said after it's been said. So I rather like someone else jumps in and takes the notes at that time. And also sometimes there's conversation that are happening, and then one person's taking the notes, and then another conversation starts, but that person has not completed the details that's required for that portion of the notes. So if you have someone else taking notes, they can jump in on that conversation and start and pick up that piece of documentation of the notes.
Awesome. Thanks, Audrey. Now, I know as program specialists and coordinators, we attend sometimes adversarial meetings and we do our best to mediate. But when you think about seating arrangement, is there a good spot, bad spot, seating arrangement wise when it comes to being the note taker?
Crystal, I would have to say when I'm taking notes, I definitely like to sit close to the case manager and either across from the parent or slightly away. I think it's important to make sure that I'm not distracting the parent with their participation during the meeting. I have noticed at times that if I'm next to the parent taking notes, I find the parent looking over my shoulder and wanting to make sure exactly what I'm writing at that moment, rather than waiting to the end when we're going to review the notes anyways.
I agree. Sometimes they seem distracted by the processes that are going on in the meeting and they don't get to fully engage when they're trying to focus on what everybody's doing in the meeting. So I think you're right on with that, John.
I like to just jump into one thing that's happened at our IEPs is that we inform the parents. If you see us typing, we're taking notes. We're both on this document. We're taking notes together so that they know that we're actually attentive to what's happening at the IEP. We're not answering emails or things like that. We're actually attending to the IEP.
So team rules, we touched on this a little bit. Is there an ideal note-taking strategy or the perfect person to take the notes?
One of my hard and fast rules is that whoever is currently presenting or facilitating really should not be the note taker. And that is because it's two different tasks trying to be done simultaneously: to facilitate an IEP or to present a report and to take notes. And I will share that when I was a case manager, that's exactly what we did. We had to take the notes for the IEP, and so they were very much skeleton and not as legally compliant as what we can do through a Google collaborative Google Doc. So I do understand when a district support personnel, a program specialist or coordinator attends the meeting, it's like, you know, I know I can trust that the notes for this difficult meeting will be legally compliant, but we definitely will be needing your help as we facilitate, look for compliance on the pages themselves, that other people are contributing and taking the lead on the note taking.
I will say that the smoothest IEPs that I've been in with regard to notes are the ones where the site administrator takes the notes, because the site administrator knows the things that are going on the site. They're responsible to listen for important legal elements in the IEP, and they can be sure to indicate when those legal elements are taking place, right? And also, they're not directly responsible to facilitate in the IEP or present information related to student progress in the IEP. So when that's done well, it makes for a very smooth note-taking experience for the team.
Awesome. Now, there's people that should not be taking our notes when we're holding IEP meetings. So I know that, again, as program specialists and coordinators, we attend a lot of meetings that have an attorney or an advocate, and there's always supposed to be a parent at our meeting. Those people land under the people that really should not be taking the notes. Do you guys have any insight on that?
When our attorneys attend the meeting, they're focused on legal compliance and making sure that the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted. They're not focusing on the notes. And I think too, again, the facilitator or the person, an attorney, they're looking forward. They're listening to what's happening. They're thinking about the questions that need to be posed. The note taker is always in arrears. They're behind, and so they're capturing what's already happened. And the parents are participants, right? And so if they're trying to take notes, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the conversation as well. But also, this is the district's document, even though it is for the student and it goes to the parent, it is a district document. And so Moreno Valley Unified School District employees are the people that should be taking the notes, and not attorneys and not parents or advocates.
I do want to circle back around to what Brian said, pointing out that the meetings that he has been to, the administrator has done well to take the lead. There's a caveat to that, and that is that Brian was at those meetings, so he was probably facilitating. So if you're at a meeting where it's just your site team, the administrator is going to be the facilitator most likely. So if your administrator is your facilitator, you're going to look towards your collaborative, your related service providers, your speech pathologist, your OTs, the case manager when she's not presenting, that would do that support.
Michelle, to add on to that, when I've teamed up with the administrator where we're working on one Google Doc between the two of us, I have found that it's easy to help facilitate because there's always clarification questions that are needed. So when there's two people working on the notes, one can see where maybe we need additional questions to add to the notes or provide clarification for what specifically was meant by a comment.
So during the IEP process, parents make requests, right? Teams discuss those requests and teams determine responses or ideas related to that request. Is there a good go-to format in the notes to document requests and discussions that come along with those requests that come from parents or advocates?
Brian, when I think about that, I usually try to document what the parent's requesting, and I try to get as much specific information about their request as I can. For an example, the parent says, "My kid needs a one-on-one." Why do you think that? Tell me more about that. What concern are you really focused on with that request? And so we discuss that as a team once we get a really clear idea of what the request is. And then, of course, the team's response to that request. It may be that we need to look at behavior because the parent's saying, "I need a one-on-one because my kid's behavior is out of control." When really we might be looking at a behavior support plan, we might be looking at an FBA. So they may start with the end in mind, but we have to really break down what the concern was so that we can make sure that our response is appropriate, aligned with what their actual concern was.
Mm-hmm. And then if we get to a situation where there's disagreement about the request and a prior written notice is necessary, are well detailed notes that discuss the parent request and the discussion after that pretty helpful in developing those prior written notices? That was kind of a leading question, sorry.
I'll jump in there, absolutely. Anytime that the district SELPA department needs to respond in writing to a parent request, we are always going to go first to the IEP itself and to the notes. We're going to read the notes in detail and see what the team considered, what the team discussed, and how do they respond, and what was their reason for choosing that response. And so those notes are really important. We may also, after that, contact the case manager, et cetera, but that is definitely very important that we have it documented, the why behind it.
And then procedurally, I'm sure there's some stuff. Obviously, we're documenting the request in the notes page, and we're documenting the discussion in the notes page. But if the parent doesn't agree to the team's determination on the request, what needs to be done in addition, not only in the notes page what needs to be documented, but after the notes page is documented, the IEP is complete, is there something that team members need to make sure they take care of?
I'll jump in on this one. So there is a common misbelief or misconception that the district has a notes reader or an IEP reader. We do not read your IEPs unless you bring to our attention that there's something worthy of a review. And so really reaching out to your program specialist or a SELPA administrator, letting them know, we had a conversation at an IEP, I need further support on this. We had to respond that a prior written notice would be provided. The more detail you can give us, the better, so that we can support you in solving the disagreement or solving where a parent needs a response. But we're not going to know that needs to happen unless you bring it to our attention.
That's a good point, Chris. And I just like to say that we need to know that as soon as possible. So I know that there is no definite hard and fast timeline for responding to a parent, but our district does like to respond within a reasonable amount of time. I think it's like within 2 weeks or 14 days. So the sooner we get that information, we can contact you, we can do all the research we need to do in order to develop or to respond to the parent with a private notice. So we definitely need that information as soon as possible.
You know, Brian, one more thing to add is when I know that a parent, when we disagree with what the parent has requested and we have sufficient information, one thing that I do like to try to do is to schedule a follow-up meeting where we can specifically address any of the concerns if that's what's appropriate.
I think that's
I will,
helpful, John, when maybe the parent brings up a concern you weren't expecting, and you really need to be able to collect some data and get back together to discuss it further. So it's not a no, it's a let us look at this. Can we meet again in 30 days or 15 days to discuss this concern in detail with the data that we have or we have collected? So I love that idea.
and I did want to point out on this slide 14, number 3, how important it is that to actually write in team has denied parent request if it in fact is denied, and that the district will respond to parents' request in writing. Actually put that verbiage in there. It's very helpful that the parent understands what's the next step so that they don't just feel like their request kind of dropped off and is not being considered.
Michelle, I really like that you said that because I was at an IEP and the team was not in agreement with the request that the parent had made. And I just looked at the parent and I said, this is not the end. I said, I will take your request to the district office, and the district office will look deeper and they will respond to your request with a private notice. And so this is not a definite no. This is just what the team is saying. Based on the information that we have, we're saying that we believe that we are meeting the students' needs. But when we go to the district office, it's still another level of support for you.
And I'm sure it's so important that those things happen. I know like the last item says that to send an email within 24 hours, because when there's a parent request in an IEP, and I know you mentioned this, Crystal, a minute ago, a timeline starts, right? So if a parent requests an assessment, for example, in an IEP, we've got 15 days from that request to get them an assessment plan, not 15 days from when you send your email to the program specialist 3 days later. So it's important to do that stuff with a little bit of urgency after it's documented in the notes as well, and communicate to those who need to know about those requests.
Thank you for that clarification, Brian, because I did say there isn't a hard and fast timeline, but there are for some things, such as when there's an assessment that's requested. So thank you for that clarification.
So we have a whole bunch of required team members in an IEP, obviously, and we spoke a little bit about them a moment ago. We have the list of everybody who's participating in the IEP on the, we list everybody on the notes page as meeting participants. Is it important in the notes page to document how each team member participated?
It's a really good question. I think the notes should clearly define each person's contribution as best as possible, whether that be asking questions or providing an answer. I know when it comes to, for example, parent questions, usually, and we addressed this previously, I will type in the notes that parents asked and then special ed teacher responded. So we know specifically who said what and have that documented in the notes.
I do want to point out there that the red note, the red part of the arrow, again, this is a summary. So although we want to have enough information, this is not a running record of the dialogue that takes place.
I was a general education teacher for many years, as well as a special education teacher. And I know that sometimes in our meetings, general education teachers don't have a lot to say or don't understand that there's an expectation that they still participate. I can tell you that as a gen ed teacher, my first couple years of IEPs, I thought my job was to sit and be quiet unless I was addressed with a question. So you may look at that when you're looking at a gen ed teacher who's not participating, and it may not be because they don't want to, but they're not sure when or how to do so. But it is important when we're discussing least restrictive environment and progress on goals, present levels for our RSP students who have a gen ed teacher majority of the day. A lot of their IEP is coming from that gen ed teacher who's sitting there silently. So we can prompt them to participate if we need them to give input. And please make sure that they know, I do want you to share. I do want you to have work samples ready so that we can show the parent how we're both collaboratively working for student success. After many, many years and having a really good RSP teacher that trained me, I would actually bring up my own file to the IEP of work samples. And I then understood when we were going over present levels and goals, that was a chance for me to speak up and share what I knew. But until I had been taught that, I didn't understand what my role really was as a gen ed teacher in IEPs.
You know, Crystal, when I was in the classroom, I taught Mod Severe, and the students didn't participate in academics that often for during their mainstream time. So I would definitely have a conversation with the general education teacher prior to the meeting about how they could participate in the IEP. And we always looked at mainstreaming for our students, even if it wasn't for academics, it was to generalize those learning to learn behaviors. So I would ask the general education teachers to share, you know, socially, what are the expectations in the classroom? What are the academic expectations? What in light of Common Core, that's when we had just transitioned over to Common Core. And so when the teacher would share that information, that would give us opportunities to look to see, maybe my student could participate in this time in your classroom. So maybe it was just calendar time and just learning how to sit and respond, you know, to generalize those learning to learn behaviors. So I would have a conversation with the teacher, and that would help to prompt them to know what to say in the IEP.
That brings us up to notes for multiple meetings. And I know, at least for me, this has been a challenge at different times because sometimes you have 5, 6, 7 meetings just to get through an annual. What's the process that each of you use when you have multiple meetings? Do you have one page of notes and you add to it? Do you have a separate page for each meeting day? What do you do?
Where our expectation is that IEPs are affirmed the same day. I often tell my case managers, you're going to forget, just affirm it before you leave the room because the parent copy matches our copy. There's nothing to change at this point. The notes are part of that affirm following IEP meeting. And when we get back together, I always tell my case managers, start a new notes page. But we always do go back when it's a multiple part meeting and we'll reread the notes from the previous meetings to help everybody remind each other of the previous conversation, how far we got, what we agreed and disagreed on, to get everybody back in that mindset. Sometimes our meetings are 30 days, 60 days apart, and it's hard to remember where we stopped and what we said. So we will always reread those notes, but then we start with a new notes page for that session.
Crystal, a clarification question. When you reread those notes, are you documenting that in the notes that the previous notes were read, or do you just read them and move? Okay.
Absolutely, John. I will have that in the notes as well. Team reread the notes from the previous meeting. Team continues to agree that that is what was previously occurred at the meeting. Parent expressed the following concern based on the notes reading from the previous meeting. There's an opportunity to have parent, after they've reflected for 30 days or 60 days, to say, wait, I said yes, but I didn't mean yes. Or, you know, I've had time to think about it and I'm okay with that. Can we move on? And so all of that can be documented. Sometimes it's a really good conversation starter to talk about where you already were before you start going where you need to go.
We are currently working on a set of procedures for multi-part IEPs. The focus of those procedures really is, and like we've said a couple of times throughout this training, is to maintain that narrative of the IEP, so that if somebody picks up, you know, part 3 of the IEP, even though you only went through the last 3 goals, they know exactly what happened throughout the whole process. And so we are going to be releasing a new set of procedures for that. And actually, we did already create a video that will be posted to our SELPA YouTube channel. So check it out, detailing those procedures and with some supports specifically for multi-part IEPs.
You know, and one thing I like to see in the notes that, you know, that they document, it's a continuation of the annual or triennial IEP held on blah, blah, blah date. And this is part 2 of the meeting or part 3 of the meeting. It's easy to follow when you have those those clarification statements in the at the beginning of the notes to tell the story as well.
Thank you for adding that, Audrey. That's very, very important.
So when we're taking notes at the IEP, are the notes taken later or are they taken at the same time? And the reason I ask that, because I've been in IEPs when I with the case carrier, and she was jotting notes down on a piece of paper, and not sure if those notes were exactly what the conversation was had during the meeting. So does anyone want to jump in and talk about their experience with that?
I might take it even a step backwards because sometimes I get into IEP meetings and the notes are already written. And that is a big concern. Sometimes the parent responses have been pre-drafted, and I completely sympathize with our case managers. I've been one myself. It is hard to keep up with the pace of an IEP. So you can have a skeleton. There's a template available, and we're going to talk about that in our training today. But things like parent responses, offer of fate, things that shouldn't be in a draft. But then moving forward, when you're talking about what goes into the notes, it should go immediately into the notes. It shouldn't be taking brief annotations to then after the meeting type it up. Like I mentioned before, the IEP should be affirmed as soon as the meeting's over, and the notes are part of that affirm. So we want the notes to also be able to be read at the end of the meeting so that the parent understands and the whole team is able to give feedback and input based on what was documented in the notes. Quite often, if it's a busy meeting or if you're trying to take the notes yourself while you're facilitating, you miss things, and that's normal. But by reviewing the notes collaboratively as a team, you can say, hey, wait, we talked about this. You forgot to put that in the notes. Can we add that? And so we can really work together to make the notes more compliant if you're able to take them in the meeting and review them when the meeting's over, and also document that you reviewed the notes and if the team agreed to the notes in the meeting.
I know we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but are we doing verbatim? Are we summarizing the information? And when we are adding the information, is it subjective or is it objective?
I think that's a really good question, Audrey. And I was thinking back when Crystal was talking about, you know, how to document the notes just now in the meeting, or what to document in the notes just now. You know, I keep thinking about how we've talked a little bit about the narrative of the IEP. So it's good to share the narrative of the IEP, but it doesn't need to be like a melodrama. Like, we don't need to know who's angry and why they're angry or who said what about who. We want to keep it objective, fact-based content. You know, the case carrier suggested this, parent responded this way, parent requested X, case carrier and team discussed and considered this request and responded this way. Input from general education teacher was XYZ, whatever. Very fact-based, very objective rather than subjective. Sometimes, you know, I'm sure it's never happened to anybody else on this chat, but so I've been in IEPs that have gotten heated before, and people say some things that maybe, you know, ought not to be documented in the notes. We want to keep the notes a professional document using professional language, and avoid language or comments that might aggravate what might already be contentious when you review the notes or when parents review the notes after.
Absolutely. So if somebody, I love the way that you put that, Brian. If a parent does make a statement that sounds heated, you can document parent shared concern in regards to, and then you list what the concern is, and that's a fact. But you don't give the specifics that would, as Brian was saying, further the contentious aspect of the IEP.
So how much is too much? You get those IEPs where you look at the notes page and it's like page after page after page, and you wonder, when is this going to end? So what are some strategies that you guys use to keep the notes succinct and to the point?
I think one of the strategies is, you know, following the collaborative IEP agenda. We do have a notes template that kind of shares information like that should be documented in the notes, and really just making sure that we are documenting participation, parent requests, making sure that we're going through, documenting that we've gone through each one of the pages of the IEP, But again, we don't have to document everything that's said verbatim, but we do need to make sure that, for example, if a parent has a request, that we follow that process that we've mentioned prior, and make sure that we document individuals' participation.
And I would say, not to go into specifics, by including information that is already in the actual content pages of the IEP. So for example, you would never want to list out all of the accommodations, or you would, even for services, the template does state the offer of faith is, and then that's followed by the placement. And then you would, but you would refer them to the services page rather than documenting the entire services. So if it's outlined specifically in the other part, you want to make a reference that it was discussed, but not be specific and relist.
I suppose this is one of my flaws, John. You and I have been in meetings together. You know that I write novel-length notes, but I like to think that they are reflective of how quickly the IEP meeting was moving and the important things that were shared. So I guess I also want to make clear, it is okay if your notes are more than a page long. There's not a right length to notes. It's as long as it needs to be to document a summary of the conversation and concerns that were expressed and the responses to each of those. So for some of my notes, I know they've been 3 or 4 pages long, but that was also for a 3 or 4 hour long meeting. So the notes should be aligned with the meeting. If you have a very long meeting, your notes might be a little bit longer. If you end up with longer notes in your meeting, it is okay to stop partway through the meeting and say, hey, my notes are getting a bit long. We've covered a lot of information. Can we take a break here? And let's go over the notes we have so far so that we can summarize up to this point. That way, when you're at the end of the meeting, you're not going over 3 or 4 pages worth of notes. Again, I'm not recommending that, but there are times that happens. It's okay to review the notes, sometimes even after you finish the present levels page. Okay, that was a good conversation about present levels. I did my best to summarize what we discussed here. I read the notes so that I can make sure we're in agreement with what I documented, and then we'll move on to the special factors page. I think that's okay to do too. If you see your notes getting long, pause, give yourself an opportunity to catch up on notes. If you're facilitating and you're the case manager and you're running this meeting, you might need to say, I'm so glad we finished that present levels page. Give me 1 second to make sure I've got all of our conversation documented the notes. And it's awkward to have everyone stare at you for that minute or two while you type. It's okay to do. It's worth documenting in the notes what needs to be documented. And you may have different strategies to support you in doing that. And those are okay.
I want to follow up with what you said, Crystal. What I like about when you stop to do a review, or when you stop to take a little break, sometimes it actually diffuses negative energy in the room as well. I've often, when I've had to stop and say, okay, let me document that, I find that people relax and they start to have these side conversations, and it actually helps moving forward. So I definitely would try that if you're feeling like it's getting a little stifled in the room.
I think just to piggyback a little bit on that, it's, sometimes I remember being in the IEP, and we had been through due process with this parent, and the parent was making requests, and the team was responding. And I just remember Dora looking at her, one of our other program specialists, and winking at her, and she said, I got you. And I, letting her know that she had documented the information in the IEP. So, we have those due process hearings. We want to make sure that we take good notes that reflect the story of the IEP.
Right, and I would, when you think of a continuum, if you will, you're not going to do verbatim, but you're going to take more, because you really want to make sure, especially if we do have to get to the point where a lawyer has to review it, they definitely will want to have more information. So you kind of want to up it a little bit if you think that there would be a due process hearing.
So the only thing I'd add in there is the sense of accomplishment. I know John and I have been involved with one particular family where I think it took 5 meetings, 2 or 3 hours a piece to get the annual done. But being able to stop partway through the notes and say, hey, look what we accomplished today. or what we've accomplished so far. We finished this. It gave this sense of like we are moving forward, even though it's taking a long time to get where we're trying to go. And so I think that also from a psychological kind of mindset, it gave this sense of like we're doing something good. We're still progressing, even though it's taking us a long time. So that's really reviewing the notes partway through if it's an adversarial meeting or if there's a lot of questions coming out, helping the parent to hear that you heard them and you responded to them and it's documented can, like Michelle said, really start to diffuse a adversarial kind of situation.
I totally agree with Crystal saying it. The parent knowing sometimes they'll say, "Is that in the notes?" So going back reviewing is an excellent idea.
Michelle, I was going to share that your strategy of taking a pause, it really does work. I remember a meeting that Crystal and I were both in. It was very contentious. One of us was working with the family and the advocate. One of us was working with the school team as a buffer in between. And when the conversation became heated, I was taking notes, I would just raise my hand. We set it up as a strategy up front that when I raise my hand, it means we have to stop because there's something in the notes to review. And what we found we were doing is every time the conversation would get heated, a hand would go up, we would go back 2 paragraphs, add a little clarification, and then review the notes and then pick it back up where we were. It really helped buffer the meeting. It helped slow it down. And I think it was a positive experience for those that were there. So other note recommendations. What do you do when you have settlement agreements? I know settlements typically occur outside of the IEP process. So what do we do in the meetings?
When the district has worked with the parent outside of the IEP process, you do not want to discuss or take note of any of the aspects of the settlement in the IEP itself. And for example, if the parent is granted tutoring services for the student, you would not want to list those tutoring services on the service lines. So they're not mentioned at all in the IEP itself. That is completely aside. Although there may be times when the parent will bring it up. But what about the tutoring I'm getting? But what about the extra speech services that I'm getting? I want to see those in there. And I'll give you an example of what you might put in the notes. Parent shared that she is receiving additional services provided through the district and would like them documented in the IEP. Administrator shared that the parent could get written documentation of those services separately by calling the district office or something like that, just so that you're making the document that the parent did ask that and you're meeting their need because you're referring them to how to get the information that they're requesting.
Michelle, I'll add to that. I have one parent in particular that likes to read her agreement to us when we have IEP meetings. And so I have learned to very kindly tell her, I appreciate that you are so aware of what has been offered to you by the district. And she will often have questions. And I tell her, you know what, I'm really willing after the IEP meeting to sit down with you, to reread your agreement with you, or to help tell you who you can contact for support regarding that agreement. But it's not part of your child's IEP. It is outside of the IEP. So if you're willing to stay a little bit later, or I can give you the contact information, then you can get support with your concerns with your agreement. And I'll just document in the notes, like you mentioned, Michelle, parent wanted to discuss the settlement agreement in the meeting, program specialist, case manager, teacher, whoever takes that concern on, shared that there are district personnel who can support the parent with their settlement agreement. Contact information will be provided at the end of the IEP meeting to the parent so that you're showing you're still supporting the parent, but that's just not something that belongs in the IEP or in the notes. So the notes template, there's a purpose to using a notes template and there's reasons why it really works. So there is a recommended notes template, but can you use the agenda or do you have to use the template?
Crystal, that's a good question. I think you can use any document that you want to use as long as it has all the information in it that you need. I know the agenda allows you to use a sequence for the meeting and make sure you hit each individual point. But I also think the template has valuable information in it as well, because you might have sentence starters or sentence stems in there that support you with your note taking.
So as you go back and forth between using the agenda and the full template to your notes, you'll find that certain ones work better for you at certain times. Like one of the things that I do when I'm facilitating IEPs is I have a notes template that I've used for a long time that's based off of the template that we use as a district. And I use that template as my agenda, right? So I can have each important item in there and make sure I hit each important item. But one of my concerns when I see agendas and actually templates that are really well developed is making sure that we don't have meeting notes templates that are totally predetermined, right? If we have information in our meeting notes prior to the meeting, like the outcomes or the offer of FAPE, if we feel like we know what the offer of FAPE is going to be and we put it in there prior to the meeting, that might be predetermined IEP notes, and that's going a step too far with the agenda, I think, or with the meeting notes template.
Unfortunately, it happens more often than you may think, where I have an opportunity to review an IEP because a parent has a concern and the template has not been adjusted during the meeting. So I will look at them and I will say, oh my goodness, did we give this to the parent? And find out that yes, it was given to the parent, and it was like, insert such and such here, or something referring to the fact that it's a template that was never deleted and then updated with accurate information during that. So that's my caution about getting too comfortable with the template, is you just may not go back to it to change the information to reflect what actually happened. And that's another good point for using a Google Doc, because you can use a notes template with highlights in it so that you will catch yourself when you have to put information in, whereby if you're using the SPACE notes, you cannot have that, that information highlighted.
That's an excellent point, Michelle. I was just thinking about that because sometimes, you know, we'll put things in the notes as our template, but I would like put ... meaning that I had to respond to that, but it was something that I knew that I needed to address in the IEP, and I had to have the parents' input or the team's input. So I would put that ... there. But I would hate to not go through that and have that come back to the district, or whomever reading it later would say, oh, you know, what's this ... mean? But
it happens.
Yeah, but using the Google Doc and the highlight is an excellent idea, because you can highlight that information and it calls your attention to it and lets you know that you do have to go back and make sure that you put information in there that's related to that IEP and nothing's predetermined.
You know, Audrey, I actually made a notes template for one of our teachers in our district to really help them with their notes. They were having a bit of trouble taking notes. And what we learned was that when you're working in a Google Doc, you can have highlight and bold and underline to draw your eyes to different things throughout the Google Doc that you need to take notes on. You can have different rainbow colors, whatever works for you to make sure you get the notes the way you want them. But when you copy and paste them into SACE, all the formatting drops. So it just looks like a nice clean document. But in the template, all of these colors and bold and underlines were there to help the teacher remember, oh yeah, every time I see bold, I need to make sure I put the student information. Every time I see underline, I need to document parent concerns. When I see this highlighted part, I need to summarize. Whatever system you have that you can use to help yourself make notes more reasonable, but still meaningful, because we don't want to predetermine our notes. I found a set of notes yesterday, actually, when I was reading, where they used the wrong student's name throughout the entire set of notes. And I realized, oh, you must have been working off a template. And when I look at that case manager's caseload, the name that appeared throughout the notes for this student was the last IEP they had held before that IEP. And they had just forgot to go back and clean up their template. And so for the student where we are now looking more deeply into what's going on, the wrong student's name appears through the entire notes.
And
Guilty. I've definitely done that in the past. And that's why it's so helpful to have a
Brian,
system.
you're really guilty.
I'm so guilty.
That's also another vote for collaboration on the notes, because if a template is not updated throughout the meeting, it's probably because the case manager was trying to facilitate at the same time as take notes, and they weren't able to give their full attention to either one. So that's typically an indication to me that the case manager was expected to take the notes throughout the entire IEP meeting, and they were just trying to juggle it. It happens. I do want to say it happens. And Brian raised his hand. I bet you I had done the same thing at some point. You know, you live and you learn.
If I have to make a choice between an agenda and a template, I kind of look at the type of meeting that I'm having. So if I expect an easy meeting and we've never had any problems and there's nothing major that's going to happen in the meeting that I'm aware of, I may just use the agenda as a template and follow that down. But if I know it's a contentious meeting, I'm going to elaborate and make almost like a custom template for the meeting. And what's included in there, I might already have typed in there what the students' progress were on the goals, but after each one, I might have a sentence stem prompting me to ask the parent if there's questions or you know, if there's clarification needed from the teacher. But I use, just like I think Crystal mentioned with the highlights, I will add different colors and then boilerplate information like, you know, parent was provided a copy of the procedural safeguards. The explanation was provided by so-and-so. And then parent asked or did not ask questions, but that might just be indicated by a couple dots. So I do have a lot of boilerplate information that I will include. But again, when I decide which one to use, a lot of times it's decided by the type of meeting and if it's going to be contentious or not.
I guess the last thing I'd share here, John, and rest of the team, is that if you're handing your notes template to someone else, you're trying to collaboratively take notes together, they should see the template before you're sitting in the IEP meeting, and they're trying to use your template that makes sense to you to take your notes for you or with you, and it doesn't make sense to them. So if you are collaboratively taking notes, or you have a related service provider or an administrator that's willing to jump on and help you take the notes, they're going to be a lot more willing to help you again in the future if the process makes sense to them and it's not a struggle to keep up with your system that makes sense to you, but it may not make sense to them. So again, just if you're using notes, we don't want to predetermine them, but we want to make sure they're defensible. Using a template is a great idea, but make sure anybody that's taking the notes with you is familiar with your template before they're sitting in a meeting and they get stressed out and stop taking notes for you, because that is the worst.
We're going to transition a little bit here to discussing the notes template specifically. We're going to go through each page of the IEP form, each form of the IEP, and discuss how that's addressed in the notes template and how specifically to document each area of the IEP in the notes page itself. So just if you're just joining us, I'm Brian Wager, a program specialist with Moreno Valley Unified, focusing mostly on the high school ED programs, on behavior, and students in the non-public school programs.
Hi, I'm Michelle Ballesteros, coordinator of mild to moderate programs.
Hi, I'm Audrey Butler, program specialist for the mild moderate elementary programs as well.
Crystal Clark, District Office Program Specialist, Elementary Mild Moderate Programs, Audrey's partner in crime.
I'm John Faringa, program specialist, and I support the middle school ED programs and our special education center, along with a few students that are at non-public schools.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the actual IEP, following the collaborative IEP agenda. And the first thing on the agenda is the introductions and the sign-in sheet. So many times we have parents that participate at our school. They're at our school a lot of the times. They participate in our classroom or volunteer. They're on committees, APAC or ELAC or PTA, and they're at our schools a lot. But some of those parents have students with IEPs. So when we have our IEPs, can you guys, one of you guys address the importance of introductions? Do we still need to have introductions even though these parents are at our on our school sites frequently? And if so, how do we document that in the IEP?
You know, Audrey, that's a really good question. I think it would be presumptuous to assume that the parent knows everyone there at the school. And I think out of respect, it's important that each person introduce themselves to the parent and that the parent knows why they're there in the meeting.
Thank you. And would you document the people that are in attendance in the notes as well?
I think documentation of each person in the IEP, each participant in the IEP is extremely important procedurally, in both in the IEP and itself, to document who was there, what their roles are, so that we know that required team members are there and we know who participated in the IEP. Including each member who's introduced themselves in the IEP notes page is actually a very important procedural element, so that we can verify everybody's participation who needs to be there, or everybody who was there.
Thank you. I think that that's important as well to identify all of the members and their roles, because a lot of times when we take notes, we'll add special education teacher shared, or general education teacher shared. So if we have those names listed along with their roles, then we can clearly identify who that person was and their participation in the meeting. So thank you for sharing that, Brian. What about if there's a team member that's not at the IEP? How would you document that in the notes?
Well, typically, if the person's not in attendance, what I would do is write specifically in the notes that an team member excusal was sent out, and the parent agreed or did not agree with that excusal at that time. If the parent did agree with the excusal, I would then note how input was provided by that team member. So if input was provided in writing, I would list speech and language pathologist was excused from the meeting. However, they provided input in writing for the team to review.
The meetings parents ask that the meeting be held without them. And we know that the law requires that we have to have at least there are 4 required members, and one of those required members is the parent. So how do you document in the notes if the parent asks that the meeting be held without them?
What I would do, Audrey, is I would state that specifically. Team received meeting notice, signed meeting notice return, indicating that the parent gives permission for the IEP team to meet without her or him, and basically document in the notes that you have that from the parent. Or if it was a phone call made, say last minute, where the parent is not able to make it, but maybe had already signed saying they would, I would document that in the notes and definitely say parent notified case manager by phone on this date that it's okay for the team to continue with the meeting without her. And then I would add an additional sentence that says IEP in its entirety will be provided to parent, and opportunity to review the IEP will be made.
Thank you, Michelle. And now that we're experiencing COVID, a lot of our meetings are being held virtually. So we'll definitely want to document that our meeting is being held virtually. And also, we want to make sure that we review the agenda with the parent and make sure that we document that the team has accepted the agenda as well. So there are times when a required team member is not at the meeting. The entire IEP team is required to attend the IEP. But if there's one that cannot attend, there's a process that we need to follow. In addition to that, we need to document in the IEP that person was not there, as we discussed previously. But what happens if the person, you find out like right before the IEP, it's the last minute that person is not able to attend the IEP? How would you document that in the IEP?
I had the joy of this experience about 2 years ago, Audrey. I was in a car accident on the way to an IEP meeting. And so I had to coach a brand new teacher into how to do this. And I was on the meeting notice. They were expecting me to attend just like any other team member. And so we let the parent know that there was a last minute emergency, that one of the team members wouldn't be able to participate for today. And we asked for parent permission to continue without me present. And we provided them an excusal so that they could document that in writing. We also documented it in the notes. That parent was advised that a team member was not able to make it at the last minute. Parent agreed to continue without this team member present. If she had said, or that parent had said that she did not want to continue without me, the team could have said, team agrees to reconvene, so that all team members can be present for the meeting at a mutually agreeable time.
Thank you, Crystal, because we want to make sure that we follow the law and that we don't have any procedural violations. And to hold a meeting without a team member is a procedural violation. So we want to ensure that we do not have that hiccup.
On slide 23, you'll see that as a department, we actually came up with specific notes verbiage to use when you are opening and closing an IEP to preserve the date. So you will actually see highlighted there an exact quotation that we would want you to embed into the notes if you were opening and closing. So my question to the panel here is, why is it important that teams use this specific verbiage in these instances?
Michelle, I think it's important that we use the specific verbiage because the first and second lines are very important. It identifies the type of meeting that was being held, and it says the team was ready, willing, and able to hold the meeting at that point in time. It is clear that the school was ready to meet and that it was the parent who was not able to meet at that moment.
I think another reason too is that you know, we're up against a timeline many of the times when we hold these IEPs, and we do not want to be late for an IEP because a parent was unable to attend. So another reason why we want to include this statement is because we're telling the team or informing the parent exactly what we did. We extended the service dates along, and we changed the info eligibility dates on the dates on the info eligibility page to make sure that we are not late for our IEPs, but we're not taking any other actions. We're not changing anything in regards to the student's IEP. We're just making sure that we are compliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I did want to also add, I know we're not talking procedure here, but I think I have to give this one little plug as well. This is not a permission slip to, if you realize the day before your IEP, ooh, that one's due tomorrow, to open and close an IEP. Notice the very first bullet there. If you're up against an IEP deadline and the parent does not show after attempts to reach the parent, then you only want to embed that if you have done your part in notifying the parent ahead of time and preparing the IEP so that it is ready to present.
And make sure you actually hold that meeting afterward. It says that the team will reconvene, and then that resets your dates. So it's not going to appear that you're overdue with dates in the system, but you need to hold that meeting as soon as possible after you say that you're going to reconvene, because that's going to cause all kinds of problems. You're not actually going to have a consented to IEP, and you're going to have to continue operating on an old IEP. So while it may not show that you are out of compliance, you actually are.
So we're going to go continue along the collaborative IEP agenda. We are on the section where you would review procedural safeguards. And this is important that this is added on every notes page. So my question to you is, how does the notes documentation suggested on this slide ensure legal compliance?
Well, I think one important element is that we're documenting that we provided a copy to the parents first and foremost. Either if we're holding a virtual meeting, that we email the copy to the parents prior to the meeting, because the parent does have to receive a copy of that anytime you hold an IEP or take any kind of action. So it's important that we're documenting that they're receiving a copy. It's also very important to document that they were offered an overview of their rights and provided the opportunity to ask any questions if they had them.
Brian, one thing that I always think about when I'm thinking about when you're saying that the parent was offered an overview of their rights versus a parent was provided an overview of their rights. And quite often I see that we always put in, or we always remember to put in, that we offered them the overview. But I think occasionally we forget to put that we provided them, or parent declined an overview and stated they were aware of their rights. So we should have a statement in parent response to the rights as well, showing whether or not they had questions and our attempts to answer them and to clarify their rights for them.
I know in addressing parents' questions regarding the procedural safeguards, I know there was one instance where I had a parent who had lots of questions. So what we chose to document in the notes is that we went page by page through the procedural safeguards with the parent, because it demonstrated how we addressed each of the questions. And in this case, the parent had a question on every single page.
So a couple of months back, I did an IEP where I did check that the meeting was a triennial, and it was a triennial and an annual. And so that caused all kinds of problems, obviously, because I had to go back and make sure it was documented the right way, and it was a big mess. So I understand that it's important to make sure we have the right kind of meeting documented on the info eligibility page, right? Because that's what actually drives our dates and timelines. But why is important, or is it important to document the purpose of the meeting on the meeting notes page if it's documented there?
Brian, that's an excellent question. I think it's really important that we document on there because it ensures that we have shared with the parent the purpose of the meeting, right? So the parents know that they're coming to an IEP, but they don't always know that it's what type of IEP, because they come to an IEP on a yearly basis, and sometimes they're not clear that it's a triennial as well, or an amendment IEP. So it's important to document the type of meeting on the IEP to show that we have reviewed that with the parent.
Audrey, another example I think of is where we have multiple meetings to complete an annual. And when you're pulling all the sets of notes, having it really clear in the notes, this was an annual part 2, annual part 3. Then when you're lining them up, it's really clear to see the process and what was occurring at each of those meetings.
In every IEP notes page, we also try and document the time parameters, how long we have for the IEP meeting. Obviously, that's important so that whoever reads those notes knows exactly how long the team had planned to go, and it's important to document that we had that discussion with the parent. Do you think it's also important to document in the notes page if a single team member needs to leave early, or what time they need to leave?
Oh, Brian, I've run into this where we have offered a parent the opportunity to excuse a team member or to stop and reconvene when that team member can join the team again. And we have had the parent verbally say in the meeting, yes, I excuse that team member. And we did not hand them the excusal to sign right at that moment. We documented it in the notes. Parent agreed to excuse this team member, team agrees to get back together. Following the meeting, we forgot to send them that excusal. So the only documentation we had that team member had been excused by the parent and administrator was in the notes. So sometimes when things pop up in the meeting, the notes really can help you to defend what occurred during that meeting.
That's a great point. I also like the idea of telling the parent ahead of time, because that gives that person a notice. Say, for example, that one of the team members has to leave and they're only going to make it through the first half hour of the meeting. The parent really should be given the choice at the beginning of that meeting if they would rather postpone and reschedule at a time when the entire IEP team can be there. So I think it's a courtesy for the parent to let them know as soon as you know the information.
Mm-hmm. And if you have that time parameters component on your IEP meeting notes template, again, we've talked about using that notes template also as an agenda functionally. It's important to remember that right at the beginning. It's important to have it and document it right in the beginning. I mean, I've certainly had IEP meetings where we got to the end of somebody's time parameter that was in their head, and they said, oh, I have to be out of here in 5 minutes. And we're, only halfway through the present levels page. And, we haven't discussed that we're going to be ending. So everybody's thrown for a loop. So it's important. It's a helpful reminder to have that there in the beginning, I think.
Let's talk a moment about reviewing assessment reports and how you might want to document the review of those in the IEP. Is it enough just to check the box at the end of the IEP that the parent received a copy of the report? What do you guys do? How do you document in the notes that you reviewed it and what happened?
John, that's a good question. I like to document in the notes each service provider, including the psychologist assessment as well, each report that was reviewed, any key points from that assessment, I like to document that. And then if there's questions the parent has or any team member has, I document that information as well and the discussion that followed, just to show that we have clearly went through the assessment and discussed it, and that especially if the parent has questions, I would definitely want to document the parents' questions and how the team responded to the questions to make sure that we've addressed their concerns.
Yeah, I think documenting those parent questions is key because it documents that the parent had the opportunity to participate and engage with the assessment report. Obviously, we don't need to add everything from the assessment report. That's what the assessment report's for. But a little bit of key information and documentation and participation and engagement in that process is good to be documented in the notes.
So for a follow-up question, have you ever written in the notes that the parent was given a copy of their assessment report?
You know, that's a good question. I haven't done that, but that is because we usually check that box, but that's a good idea to show that the parent was given a copy of the IEP, especially like when the team is reviewing the IEP, the parent can have a copy in front of them and they can look at the copy of the IEP, the assessment at the same time. I think another important part too is to talk about whether or not the team agreed or disagreed, because when those assessments come in, those are recommendations by the school psychologist and by the service providers. It's an IEP team decision about what services and that the student requires and eligibility as well. So I think documenting the team as in agreement with the report is also something that should be documented.
John, one more thing I also would document here, in addition to saying that the parent received a copy of the report, I might include whether or not the parent requested a copy of the report to be translated for them, because on occasion we do have parents that request reports be translated for them following the meeting.
Now, Crystal, would you ask them at every meeting or would you wait for the parent to make the request?
I ask my parents at every meeting, would you like this to be translated for you? Because I want to be consistent in asking that question and documenting their request.
I think we also want to make sure that we document if a parent has been provided a translated or English copy prior to the IEP meeting. We want to make sure that we document that as well.
And I would add to that, make sure they get the final copy of the report at the meeting, because often there are changes that occur between when they're provided the draft copy and when they receive the final copy.
Absolutely.
That's a good point, Crystal. Moving on to eligibility. Every student is eligible for special ed services when they have a qualifying disability that impacts their education. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to ask, but I'm going to string them together for all of you. What do you like seeing in the notes for legal compliance? And is it enough to just write team agreed on eligibility? And what would you document from the conversation? Share a little bit of your rationale.
I think it's important to document which eligibility categories were considered and have that in the notes. I recently had an IEP where the team was reviewing an IEE, and part of the recommendation of that IEE was that we change eligibility categories. This wasn't even the child's triennial review, so we weren't necessarily considering eligibility, but it was helpful to have there in the notes that what the recommendation from the IEE was, what eligibilities he currently had and what we were considering, so that we could document what that conversation was and how that conversation evolved over the meeting.
Another student I think of when I think of really clearly documenting eligibility conversation in the notes of an IEP meeting is for some of our moderate severe students especially, their eligibility may be listed as multiple disability, and really having the conversation about what that meant for that student and the considerations that went into determining multiple disability really was the best summary of what their eligibility is.
I've even had a case where the team discussed, based upon an independent evaluation, we discussed in detail which would be the primary eligibility, which would be the secondary eligibility, because people on the team had different perspectives on that. So that's another time that it would behoove you to say, team agreed that student's primary eligibility will be, and the second eligibility will be.
I guess I could throw two more cents in, John. Another one I think of as I look at your questions on the screen are our students who are not found eligible for special education. They may actually have a disability, but they're not eligible for special education services. So really clearly documenting the team's conversation when determining that they were not eligible will help to explain that decision should it ever be questioned in the future.
So a transition plan is needed for students who are going to be 16 during the effective dates of the IEP. How should we document in the notes that we've addressed the transition page?
You know, Brian, working with some of the high school students, I think it's important to specifically document the student's input, because the transition plan is about the student and how we're going to support him as he leaves school and what skills we're going to help him develop. While the parents' input is important as well, I think this is the one aspect that really needs the students' participation, and that we should document how we gather the information, whether by interview, informal assessments, things like that. But this is a big one for the high school kids.
Right. Yeah. One way I like to think about it is that the ITP really starts to drive the process in some way once a student's 16 or older, because it's their desires that are driving our decisions for what and how we're going to instruct that student and what skills we're going to work on building. So yeah, I think it's really important as well that we make sure that that participation is documented, and that if the student participated in the meeting and participated in the discussion of the ITP during the meeting, that's well documented as well. What questions did they have? What concerns did they have? What were their ideas that they shared during the meeting? And if they didn't participate during the meeting, then it's very important to note in that ITP section that they did participate in the development of that ITP.
You know what, Brian, one thing you mentioned, it just sparked something that I remembered from a CDE review in a different district. We actually had to go back and review our transition plans with high school students who were not on the invitation as being invited. So CDE wanted to make sure the student had their input. So we had to hold another meeting and review it with the student present.
Yeah, it's very important, I think. And I think it's one of those things that sometimes we on IEP teams kind of tend to gloss over the ITPs as, you know, additional or maybe non-essential elements. But that student participation is essential. It's key, and documenting it well is very important.
So when we're looking at the present levels portion of the IEP being documented in the notes template, sometimes the present levels speak for themselves as far as the content provided in the IEP, but it doesn't give you really the insight to the conversation that happened while the present levels were being presented. So which team members might you expect to be documented in the notes as people that were contributing to the conversation while reviewing the present levels of an IEP?
No, Crystal, I think I totally agree with you. The present level page really does speak for itself. But there's specific information that we may not have prior to the IEP, and that is parents' input. So any of their input, any of their concerns, you want to definitely document that. And you want to also tell how you address their concerns if they have any concerns. Also, the general education teacher, a lot of times they attend the meetings and we don't have clear documentation of their participation, but we definitely need to include how the general education teacher participated. And a lot of times it's on the present levels page, especially when we have students that are receiving resource services and they're in the general education environment for the majority of their day, or students that are being mainstreamed as well.
So as we previously discussed, our district does have expectations for how we are responding to parents and how we are documenting that in the notes of the IEP. You can feel free to slide back to slides 13 and 14 if you want more information on the exact procedure we'd like you to follow. But please know that when you are taking notes and parent is expressing a concern or a question, that you should be responding it to directly, and it should be documented in the notes.
Thank you for mentioning that, Crystal. If somebody were to review the IEP that wasn't present and there was a parent concern that was listed, maybe the IEP team did respond, but if they don't document that response, the person reading it would think that that's a concern that was left unanswered, you know, that we haven't addressed the student need in that area. So district response is just as important as the parent concerns. I'm glad you pointed that out.
Crystal, I sometimes use a strategy in the meetings. When a parent has multiple concerns, I kind of bullet them really quick in the notes. And as we continue with the meeting, it does allow me to go back and ask follow-up questions of like general ed teacher or special ed teacher with how a goal might address parents' concerns. And at the same time, at the very end of the meeting, we're able to look at the notes and ask the parent, did we address all of your concerns? We discussed he couldn't add, your student can't read, and we would specifically spell out exactly what we discussed, and parent can agree or disagree that we've addressed all the concerns.
Awesome. And document that as well, that you went back and reviewed all parent concerns.
The law says that we do have to look at special factors that impact students' access to curriculum and to meet their IEP goals. So what information would you document in regards to assistive technology, low incidence, and English language learners? Those are some of the topics that's on the special factors page. How would you document that you discussed that?
Yeah, these are important elements that actually require some discussion by the team. And unfortunately, sometimes there are things that we tend to gloss over. We might just have it in the box on the special factors page that this student doesn't require assistive technology, for example, but it is something that the team discussion needs to actually take place regarding. We actually need to have that team discussion about assistive technology. Is assistive technology required to allow this student to access something that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access? And why, right? And that discussion needs to be documented in the notes as part of the IEP process. We document what the team's decision on that area is on the special factors page, but the discussion related to that topic should be documented in the notes.
You know, when we're talking about assistive technology, what if a parent or someone has a concern and they're recommending maybe consultation or assessment? Would that be documented in the notes if, regarding assistive technology? How would you document that?
If a parent makes a request for assistive technology in the meeting or a request for assessment, it's important for the team to have the discussion about, is this going to result in an assessment for assistive technology, or is this the kind of thing that we want to look at a consult for assistive technology? And document that discussion and where the team arrived as a result of that discussion in the notes.
Thank you for bringing that up, Brian. I know that we are not going all the way into process here, but I will tell you some more process will be given in terms of assessments versus consults. However, at this time, if you are in an IEP meeting and there is a formal request for assessment from the parent, you would want to put in the notes something like, a formal assistive technology assessment was requested by parent. Case manager will contact program specialist and complete the referral to begin the assessment process. That way it's documented exactly what the next steps are for parent. If somebody on the IEP team, if they're having the discussion and they're thinking, gosh, well, you know, what might be available? I'm not sure. They can, instead of processing a request for assessment, they can put something in the notes such as, the team discussed assistive technology and agreed to an assistive technology consult with an AT specialist. Case manager will contact program specialist and complete a referral to begin the consult process. So that way you can decipher between the two. Was it an actual assessment?
Michelle, another instance is when, our teachers in our district are experts in their field. So as the conversation is happening in the meeting, they may have their own idea of what really needs to be trialed related to assistive technology. You would also document that in the notes that the team agrees to do a trial session of however many days the team agrees to, and get back together to review the success or the progress the student made during that trial session. So it's not necessarily a consultation. The team themselves already has an idea of what might be adequate to support that student related to assistive technology.
Many of our students do not require low incident services or equipments, but for our students that do, how will we document that in the notes?
So when I think of low incidence students, I think of our students that are blind, deaf, blind, or have other orthopedic impairments that are part of their disability. And so they have a specialist that would be guiding the team through the conversation when we get to this portion of the special factors page. I think when I get to the notes on this, I would document any key factors that are considered, discussed. If there, for example, is a concern with mobility, and that's what the low incidence service is related to, I would document that there were concerns with mobility and how the team discussed and addressed that concern.
For our English language learners, this would be another topic that would be documented in the notes if there's some discussion surrounding the English language learner students. But again, not for all of our students would we have documentation in the notes for them, but we just need to consider the special factors. If it's related to our students, if there was information that was discussed in particular about that student, then we want to make sure that we document that in the notes of the IEP. Okay, so another section that's on the special factors page is student behavior. So we want to make sure that we cover this portion, that we document that the team has discussed any behaviors that the student has, and we've covered this section. So how would you document that in the notes for students that have behavior concerns?
Well, Audrey, I think when it comes to the student's behavior impeding learning, it's clear whether or not the student does. It's a checkbox, right? But I know in terms of CDE, they've lately been asking to see specifically in the notes whether or not the student's behavior impedes learning and whether or not the team reviewed the positive behavior intervention strategies and supports. So what I've started to do in the IEPs is write in the notes specifically, the student has behavior that impedes learning. And then I would document any specific discussion or comments about the behavior that was written on the IEP document itself. And then specifically in the notes, I put the team reviewed the positive behavior intervention strategies and supports.
Want to make sure that we also, if the student has a behavior support plan, that we document that we've reviewed that and that we've attached it to the IEP. Of course, our behavior intervention plans are a part of the IEP, and so you would document that as well. But for behavior intervention plans, of course, that requires our school psychologists, our behavior support, BCBA.
So at every annual IEP, we should be reviewing the progress on prior goals. What are some ways that you document this? What verbiage are you using, and how would you document apparent disagreement with progress on the goal?
I like to make discussion about goals in my IEP notes very clear, right? So goal 1, title, any team discussion related to that goal, whether the student met the goal or did not meet the goal, and move on. I think it's nice to have a really clear, concise description of what the goals are, whether or not the student met each goal, and any conversation about each goal on that notes page, because it really helps to drive and support whatever the narrative of that IEP discussion was, right? However that IEP discussion moved along, because the goals are going to be an important component of that conversation.
One of the things I like to do too is ask the parent, are they in agreement with the goal? And do they have any questions about the goal? And so then also document that. But if a parent is not in agreement, then we want to document that parent is not in agreement with the goal. And then you want to document the discussion and how it was resolved for the team, how you resolve the parent's concern regarding that goal.
Another thing, in addition to that, is that if you have a goal that was only partially met or not met, you can say the team discussed the goal and modified the goal, and it will be continued on the new IEP. So remember, we don't just want to drop a goal that's not met or only partially met. So this focuses around the discussion of how to modify the goal to make it effective and appropriate for the student.
Another thing I'm careful to include when we're looking at progress on prior goals and propose new goals is I like to document the data that teachers are presenting or work samples that are shared in the meeting. If it's not documented in the notes, it quite often gets left out.
Yes.
We use that data and documentation to develop the goals, but if there's a disagreement about a goal, whether or not it was met or why a goal is being proposed, our data really is the foundation of why we are marking goals met and not met, and why we're developing new goals for future progress. So documenting in the notes the data being shared with the parent is the foundation of why the goals were developed to begin with.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so helpful. And you don't need to go crazy with it. You can add it in there quickly. Teacher shared a work sample related to this goal. Student is at 60% accuracy or whatever. You don't have to copy and paste an Excel spreadsheet in there. Make it simple to document that you had that conversation.
Now, one other question. I know taking notes during the meeting sometimes is a challenge. People talk fast, others slower. But Brian, you mentioned that you like listing out the goals, goal one, let's say writing production. Would you, before the meeting, go into the notes, maybe under review of prior goals and pre-write the names of the goals? So then it's quicker to catch up the conversation?
That would certainly be helpful. What I do is I use a Google document. I know we've talked about that a little bit in the past. I use a Google Doc and I just have my little goal area on my notes template pre-formatted to be numbered. So I just can click on number one, and then as soon as I hit enter to write the title of the next goal, I already have it formatted that way. So that makes it a little bit easier. That's one way you could do it. But I think adding those titles in beforehand would certainly help. Not only document that you went through each goal, but that would certainly help drive the conversation to make sure you addressed each goal as well.
Well, I think this is a good segue into the next slide that we have. And what you mentioned in being crystal clear in why we review the goals and whether or not the student met them, didn't meet them, and the conversation. I've read notes, I'm sure all of you have. I've probably taken notes and just typed in there, new goals read, new goals reviewed. And over time, you develop better best practices. So what sort of details do each of you include in the notes when you're reviewing new goals? Do you call them draft goals, proposed goals? Give us some hints. What would you put?
I typically call them proposed goals. They could be drafted goals, but I usually call them the goals that we're proposing to the team to for the student to have educational benefits. So I put them in as proposed new goals and share them with the team.
Yeah, and it's important to discuss those new goals and discuss any parent concerns or team input regarding those new goals, and document the discussion around each new goal. So as you list each proposed goal, document the discussion surrounding each proposed goal. So if the parent had a comment about how this goal was going to be measured, or a parent had a question about whether this goal would be addressed by the speech and language pathologist or by the special education teacher, document those discussions, document those areas of concern in the notes page as well.
So it sounds like what you were saying is if there was disagreement with the goals, language or things like that, you would also document specifically what was changed in the revised goal? Mm-hmm. Or would you leave it the same? What would you put in the notes?
What I typically put is, here's the drafted goal. Here are the discussions around the drafted goal. And if that drafted goal was changed, I'm not going to go through the entire goal verbatim in the notes page, right? That's what the goal page is for. But I might make references to changes we made to the drafted goal. Team decided to change the percentage of accuracy in goal number 2 to 85% rather than 80% or whatever. So if I'm making changes, I'm documenting those there and the discussion regarding those changes. But I don't think the entire text of whatever goal is eventually agreed upon is necessary in the meeting notes. If we're carrying a goal over, I think it's important to document that we're carrying a goal over, how that goal was modified and why we're carrying it over, and whatever changes we're using or whatever changes that we're implementing on that goal that we're deciding to carry over. Because we need to show progress. We need to show educational benefit. If we do decide to carry over a goal, that goal should be modified and instructional practices instructional practices being used to address that goal should be modified, discussed, and documented as well.
All right, so how would you document parent agreement with the goals? What would you write?
I kind of make it quick and easy at the very end of the notes discussion, or at the very end of the goals discussion. I'll say parent is in agreement with all of the goals as written.
The only change I would make to that, Michelle, is that if there's a goal that's contested, I might list parent is in agreement with goals, blah, blah, blah. Parent is in disagreement with or would like to further consider goal, whichever goal that was.
So Brian, some things that you mentioned sparked something that I experienced, a memory of something I experienced. I was involved in a CDE comprehensive review for ed benefit. And one thing that we kept referencing were the notes of the IEP to understand why goals may have been carried over and not changed. And what we encountered was a student who had 2 IEPs sequentially, and the goals were identical for the most part. There was one word changed, but effectively it really didn't change the function of the goal or what they were working on, the skill. So we would always go to the notes to try to understand what happened. Was the goal partially met? Did they get to 40% and not 80%? What was the rationale for keeping the goals? Well, the notes only said new goals reviewed, goals carried over. There was no rationale. And when it's just, you try to understand, you read the notes to understand what happened at the meeting. It paints the picture for us about how we arrived at that destination. And in this case, there wasn't enough in the notes to help us understand.
Yeah, and I've had a student in the past that had a similar concern. And I know that we documented in the notes very, very carefully that the student developed a seizure disorder and therefore was regressing very quickly as we were trying to make progress. So in that case, the repeated goals each year make sense, but the notes were the thing that really held it together so that it was clear why they kept repeating.
So throughout this presentation, we have highlighted how important it is to include parent input into the IEP, into the notes. And so can any of you give an example of how you might reflect parent participation on the statewide assessments page, or is it even necessary?
Absolutely, Michelle, it is necessary if there is parent input, but I know when you're looking at statewide assessments, you're going through each one of those areas for students who are eligible for taking the assessments, because they only take it from grades 3rd grade through 11th grade or 11th grade. We definitely want to document any input the parent provided in regards to the accommodations that the student will receive when taking those statewide assessments.
Normally, to lead the discussion about accommodations that might be needed for the student, I try to remind the team that the accommodations we want to list are what they're utilizing in the classroom. And I try to lead the conversation with that, because sometimes parents, and again, they're advocating for their kids with the best way they can with what they feel is important. Sometimes parents want to see them with every single accommodation, and it's not something that they're using in the classroom. So by front loading the conversations, parents at that point are able to participate and say, well, at home, he's using this sometimes. And we can document that whether or not he's using that as well in the classroom.
So we're on the offer of FAPE, the service options page, the service options considered. So on this page, we would like you to document any service options that were considered and any concerns that the parent has. So what if a parent says, what are all of the options? My child has been struggling for years, and now that he's eligible for special education, I want him to be in a special class. How would you document that discussion in the notes?
Michelle, with something like this, where you might not be sure where the parent's going with their request, what I try to do is summarize what everyone heard as being the needs for the student. So I might start with the parent and say, what do you feel is most important for your student? So he reads at a 5th grade level and he's in 4th grade. So do you think he's able to keep up with a fast pace of instruction or slow pace? So if there's a question that I may have, by taking a moment with parent and each team member to identify specifically what they feel the needs are of the student. Then from there, I would describe each and every service option to the parent. And then if the parent had concerns with pace of instruction, I would make sure in the description that the pace of instruction was described, or the class size, things like that.
I love that idea, because rather than just giving the parent an overview and discussing all options, you tie it directly to the child so that you answer the question tied specifically to the student needs. I really love that answer. Perfect. Potential harm effect considered. What should we be documenting on the notes page when the case manager is covering this section of the IEP?
So obviously the discussion about potential harmful effects needs to happen in every IEP, because we need to discuss and consider and determine as a team whether or not the potential harmful effects of the services being recommended are worth the benefits of the services being recommended. Because anytime we provide services, special education services, we are either pulling a child from general education time, or we're providing service where they don't have access to their peers, or even to the most restrictive setting where we're providing service outside of a comprehensive campus where they don't have any access to non-disabled peers or the general education environment at all. It really is important to have that discussion about whether or not it's warranted and necessary in order for the student to make educational progress. Just like when we're prescribed something by our physician, right? Are the side effects, the potential harmful effects of me taking this medication worth the benefits that I'm going to reap as a result of me taking this medication? This is an important discussion, and I think the team discussion in this area needs to be documented in the notes in a clear way, and any concerns that the parent has regarding this discussion should be documented in a clear way. So if the parent has a question about the level of restrictiveness about a program that's being considered, this would be a good time to document that in the notes.
Right, and exactly. I think the phrase that comes into mind is informed consent. If you haven't discussed with the parent what the potential harmful effects are they truly giving informed consent to the IEP for the services? You have to give them both sides, the benefits and the potential harmful effects. Mm-hmm. Moving forward in discussing supplementary aids, services, and other supports, my question to the team is, does the note taker have to detail all accommodations on the notes page? If not, then what would be important to document?
Michelle, I think that's a great question. I don't think we have to list all of the accommodations in the notes. I think what's more important is to list that we discussed and reviewed either proposed accommodations or proposed modifications, whatever we're proposing, just list that we reviewed that. And then I would highlight any discussion around it. So for example, if we're recommending one specific accommodation and a teacher says that won't work in this class, great, document the discussion of how you could have a similar accommodation to address that one specific class. But I wouldn't list everything in detail.
And then specifically, if there are any parent concerns that pop up about the accommodations or discussion around any particular accommodations, document that discussion and those concerns as well on that notes page.
Right, and we should also make sure we document parents in agreement with that, because if they have a disagreement with an accommodation that's offered and then there's discussion about it, then we want to make sure that they're in agreement with the final decision.
Absolutely, and especially if a parent asks for an accommodation that the team is not recommending, you would want to document the discussion around that, and you would want to support the decision not to add that accommodation with data that you've taken on the student in that area.
So moving down the services page, the next portion of the services page that might appear in the notes is transportation. And transportation notes tend to be pretty brief unless there's some sort of unique circumstance. What unique things about transportation do you guys typically recommend do get included in the notes?
So it's important to discuss in the IEP and document in the notes page the conversation surrounding transportation. We need to document specifically whether or not the student requires transportation and why they require transportation. So hitting that transportation eligibility issue. So Usually if student requires transportation, it has to do with the age and nature of the disability of the student or the availability of the program that the student requires at the student's home school. So if a student requires a program that's not available at their school of residence, then they would require transportation in order to access that program. That conversation and also the parent's response to the offer of transportation, if it's necessary, whether or not the parent, you anticipate the parent will accept that offer of transportation. If there's any conversation surrounding that, should be documented in the notes page.
Awesome. So sometimes students require special supports during transportation. Do you document that only on the IEP, or would you put that in the notes as well?
So I think if there's unique transportation needs, like maybe a harness, I think it would be important to document. In the notes, I would put the discussion, but on the page, I would list that transportation would include the harness to be used. Because if you put it in the notes, transportation may not find it. And then it's up to each person or a case carrier to read each IEP to determine whether or not those special considerations are necessary. So at least if you put it on the IEP page specifically, it's easy for someone to know what the student needs are.
Okay, one more question before we move on from transportation. If the student's program is projected to change partway through the year, or it's projected to change at the beginning of the next school year, is there anything different you would do about the notes?
That's an excellent question, Crystal. And that happens a lot when our students transition from preschool to a comprehensive elementary school. And then also when they're transitioning from elementary to middle school, a lot of times our students are returning to their home schools. So at that time, we will document in the notes and also on the transportation box that the student will continue to receive transportation through the end of the school year. But due to the student returning to their home school or their school of residence, the student is no longer eligible for transportation services. And at that time, they will not be receiving transportation.
And I'd like to add also, even if the student is not transitioning, so you're not going to know transportation for each annual year, we are asking case managers to add this bit that's on the orange, in the orange oval there. Transportation will be offered within the district boundaries as long as he or she resides within the district boundaries, is enrolled in MVUSD, and the program is not offered at his or her school of residence. You would embed that into the notes if the only reason that the student is receiving transportation is because the program is not available at the resident school site. And what that does is that kind of sets the parent up. So if you're a second grade case manager or third grade case manager, that parent may think that transportation will always be offered. So that lets them know the reason that they're receiving transportation, and at some point it may not be offered as a service.
So notes on ESY tend to be brief as well. As we continue down the services page and we're talking about what the notes on services might look like. What things about ESY eligibility would you include in the notes as we're reflecting on a student having regression or difficulty with recoupment or not having those concerns?
On the notes page, we would document that the team did discuss extended school year and determined that based on current data that the student either they do require or they do not require ESY.
Awesome. Thanks, Audrey. Now, something I do tend to see from time to time when we're looking at ESY and transportation is when a parent does not want those things. Where would we document that a parent does not want transportation or does not want ESY, although it's recommended by the team?
That's a good question, Crystal. Sometimes we do offer services, or the student is eligible for services, and so they're part of their offer of FAPE, but the parent does not want ESY, or they do not want transportation, but it's still a part of our offer. So we still include that in our offer, but we document that the parent is declining these services at this time. But it still should be documented in the IEP and continue to be offered as a service.
Crystal, I noticed on the slide, there is a bubble that says ESY eligibility worksheet. If the team decides to use that worksheet, I highly recommend that everyone get a peek at it before the meeting and really understand what the questions are asking. Because when you read it talks about milestones, and when you look at where the student is in terms of skill acquisition, it's hard to pull back those words once you say them in the meeting that, oh yes, the student would benefit from an extra 2 weeks or 4 weeks to learn this skill. But again, it's not about them learning a new skill. It's about regression and recoupment. So if the team's going to use the worksheet, review it ahead of time, have a discussion, and then include that in your numbered IEP packet. Include it as a page at the end. And then whoever looks at the IEP in the future will understand how you came to that conclusion.
So next we're looking at special education related services in the notes. And do you write out the exact offer of FAPE in the notes?
That's an excellent question, Crystal. We are required to write a offer of FAPE statement and with the exact offer of FAPE that we're offering to the parent in terms of the services, but not every single detail. So if we're offering specialized academic instruction, transportation, ESY, we would just document those things that we're offering, the services, and then we would add see service page for details. So that would make the person go back and look at the service page for the details for those specific services that are offered for the student.
Awesome. Now, parents are also supposed to be well informed and understand what the district's offer of FAPE is, and sometimes they don't agree. So what are your thoughts on that, guys, when we're documenting parent response to the offer of FAPE?
Crystal, when that occurs, what I try to do is document specifically what the parent disagrees with and why. So if the parent says, I disagree with the offer of FAPE, I would try to go item by item through the services or what we're offering and specifically hone it down, try to narrow it down. So should there be a continuation IEP, we know exactly what we have to address at that point in time.
Awesome. And do you guys document whether or not parent is in agreement with the offer of FAPE in the notes?
I think that's really important. I also document if the parent understands the offer of FAPE, if they have any questions, and then I also ask them, are they in agreement with the services that's being offered to for the student?
So obviously our COVID closures turned everything upside down and everything in our process has changed, and we're delivering services totally differently now, or as of now, right, during school closures. How should we document distance learning and plans for future emergencies in the notes?
Brian, I'll take this one. We do have additional IEP pages that we now need to complete, and you should be aware of that through previous trainings. But in the notes, when we're speaking specifically about the notes, you want to document parent and team participation in the discussion of the emergency conditions page. So you would want to document that the team completed the alternative remote and distance learning services during emergency conditions page as part of the IEP meeting. In addition to that, this presentation there does have a link to a video that discusses a paragraph that you need to embed as well into the notes page.
So on this slide, if you open up the slide deck that was shared with you, there's a link right on this slide. You can click to access that text that you can copy and paste directly into your notes page.
Okay, the offer of FAPE educational setting page is, for the most part, a summary of what you've already discussed when you worked on the services page. The top part, you're going to check a box, whether it's general ed PE or specially designed PE. You're going to update the program setting for the percent time in general education. You'll mark whether or not there's other agency services for the student. And then you're going to mark whether or not there's progress on goals for promotion, if it's district criteria for promotion, how parents will be informed, and whether or not they'll get notification by progress summary or something different. On the bottom of the page, there's a little box where you would detail any supports the student may need for transition. but this should be a very quick page for you when you're in the IEP.
John, something else you might include when you're looking at the educational setting page and the percentages, if you have a student who is not in a general education placement, perhaps an SDC placement, and you have a plan for mainstreaming, you would also be able to detail some of that in the notes, specific plan for the implementation of mainstreaming for that student.
So then as far as notes, we're just documenting that we discussed those percentages. That's pretty much it.
So as we start to wind down the meeting, one of the last things that we're going to do is review the IEP team meeting notes. So we're going to begin by proofreading the IEP meeting comments as we read them. We're going to ensure that what is written is also consistent with other portions of IEP. My question is that numbers 3 and 4 on this slide are regarding disagreement. So how would you document this, and I'm going to say politely and professionally in the notes? So for example, if the site team members do not agree with the comments, it would be the administrator or the district representative who would decide if the comments should be changed. But if it was the parent that was the only one disagreeing with the IEP comments, you would want to add the parent's perspective or suggest that parent attach a dissent to the comments. So how would you, if the parent is in disagreement, how might you record that in the notes?
Michelle, I think one thing when you're looking at a parent in disagreement is to try to be as specific as possible, because oftentimes parents are in disagreement about one portion of the IEP. And so they're not necessarily in disagreement with the IEP. So asking the questions, getting the specific details, and including that in the notes. If parents are disagreeing about something specifically in the notes, the team can have a conversation and determine whether or not that's something they can edit in the notes, or if it's something that the team feels needs to be documented in the notes, suggesting to the parent that perhaps they can include their own set of notes that can be attached to the student's IEP that gives their perspective on how the events occurred during the IEP meeting.
Thank you, Crystal. Next question is, does anyone here have a real life example of what you would not want to write to document disagreement?
Michelle, there are times where meetings can become very adversarial, and at times parents are targeting a specific service provider, a specific employee, and the language that they're using can be very offensive. I don't think they intend that way, but they're very passionate about what they're discussing with the IEP team. It's their child. We want to be sensitive in the notes when we're documenting those kinds of conversations to incorporate what the team is directing the parent to. So if there's a concern about an employee, directing them to the right processes for that. If the language in the meeting is not necessarily as professional or appropriate as the team would like, we can say that the team took a break to allow all team members to refocus and come back focused on the student's needs and for student success. But we wouldn't want to say student said or parent said in the exact quote of what the parent said in the meeting. That can be embarrassing. And in many cases, the parents are very emotional about what they're discussing, and different people discuss things they're emotional about in different ways. So we would want to just be very sensitive to how we're documenting something that may come across very emotionally in an IEP team meeting in a professional way in our notes that we would want to defend should someone else read them.
With some of the families I work with, I try not to get to the end of the notes and know there's going to be a disagreement. So if I know that the parent is sensitive to certain language, I try to take a moment during the meeting, review the notes more frequently so we're not at the end trying to remember what we discussed 2 or 3 hours ago, or even an hour for that matter. But in those instances where the parent surprises you and you're at the end of the meeting and they disagree with everything, I do try to remind them that the notes are for the district and we're happy to attach whatever they give us.
I do want to highlight something Crystal said about you wouldn't want to include direct quotations. So this is definitely one piece. It is if there's a specific disagreement, you would not want to include direct quotations if it's heated and if there are opinions being shared. So you may want to instead paraphrase and say parent believes, parent feels, something along those lines, and rephrase.
I may have shared this story, but there was one IEP that I was in where things really did get quite heated, and parents were making all kinds of accusations and using very colorful language to describe one of our administrators who was there in the meeting, by the way. So it was a very awkward situation. And we didn't write down the things that they were saying about that administrator and the personal attacks, but we did make mention that the parent was concerned about the level of competence of the staff member and expressed that concern in the meeting, without mentioning any of the personal attacks that they were making.
Nice. I want to say something here too, is that I want to point out number 3, because sometimes it's actual team members. And I want to say, if you are repeatedly having instances where your IEP team, the site team, is not in agreement, it's a sign that you're not aligned, and that really needs to be addressed outside of the IEP meeting through a staffing. So if you find yourself trying to figure, how am I going to document this disagreement between the gen ed teacher and the special ed teacher, address those things proactively prior to the IEP meeting.
I think the other part to remember is it's about consensus. It's not about 100% agreement. So as long as everyone has something they're able to work with, it's a working document and we're moving forward to support the student.
And it's fluid, right? We can come back to the table in 3 days if we need to, or if we don't need to, we can come back to the table in a year. Can you give me an example of why it is important to document the parent level of consent in an IEP? Because we have had situations whereby a parent may consent to everything in an IEP except for one component. So what would you want to put in the notes when something like that happens?
Well, Michelle, I think that, it's important that we get parents, well, we have to have parent consent to implement the IEP. And I think sometimes parents are in disagreement with specific parts of the IEP, but not the total IEP. So we want to make sure that we clearly explain to the parent that they do have that option. And then we want to document parent is in agreement with the offer of FAPE with the exception of. And then that way we can get get an agreement so that we can start to work on the IEP with the student, as opposed to just leaving the IEP unsigned and we're working on previous goals for a length of time.
And even if parent doesn't consent to the IEP and doesn't want to consent even to a part of the IEP, with an exception, we always ask that the parent signs in participation so that we can document their participation in that conversation and in that IEP team meeting process. I also try to document in the notes page, if a parent is not consenting, that they did sign in participation as well. I've had parents in the past who have declined even signing in participation, but we do document in the notes page that they did participate in the meeting. So at least we have some evidence that there was participation and inclusion of their ideas and opinions.
And I know we're not going into procedural on this tape, but I do want to say very quickly, if that happens and you document they are in agreement with the exception of, that you come back to the IEP table to address those concerns within the next 30 days. As a team, we would like to thank you very much for your time in reviewing this important information that we have shared. And I also want to thank the additional members of the team for collaborating with me on this presentation. I'm glad that we are able to get this out.